I don't think it's justified as punishment, and I don't think it's justified as deterrence because airstrikes on ISIS members will not deter other ISIS members from engaging in further action. These people seem to me essentially undeterrable. That is, they don't mind blowing themselves up. They don't mind becoming martyrs to this. So they can't be deterred. The only reason to strike against them is defense. I worry about airstrikes because the ISIS forces are now concentrated in cities in Iraq and Syria, and they are interspersed among the civilian population, and it seems to me that airstrikes are going to be largely indiscriminate if they are aimed at ISIS members. Now, there is some indication that some of the targets for these strikes are facilities that provide income, that provide resources or funding for ISIS. And to the extent that those targets can be destroyed without harming civilians, then I think the airstrikes are a very good idea. But I'm reluctant to endorse any strikes on targets in the Syrian or Iraqi cities where the ISIS fighters are located. What that means, though, is that I think that dislodging the ISIS fighters from the cities is going to involve the use of ground troops. I think I can't say what the sources of Obama's reluctance are with any certainty, but I imagine it is that the United States population is very weary of having soldiers fighting in the Middle East after the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. My reason for reluctance about sending American soldiers into those cities is that the members of ISIS and their supporters and people who may be wavering in whether they want to support ISIS or not regard the United States and other countries that might participate in such an action as crusaders. And in some ways, this is what they expect, and in some ways, this is what they want. This is part of the fulfillment of certain prophecies that they believe in, that the crusaders will come again, and so on. And so having the so-called crusaders there yet again might be a very effective recruitment tool for ISIS. And for that reason, I think it's much more important that the bulk of the ground forces be drawn from people who are indigenous to the region. There's certainly Shiite Muslims who are threatened by ISIS. There are Kurds, there are Yazidis, there are other groups there who are more immediately threatened, I think, than people in the West are, and they should be, to the extent possible, mobilized, trained, armed, and helped to dislodge the ISIS fighters from these cities. As regards child soldiers who are being used for unjust purposes, the killing of innocent people, I don't think those child soldiers, if they are particularly young, I mean, the definition of a child soldier is a bit vague, but I think anyone up through the age of 17 or something counts as a child soldier in the traditional understanding of what it is to be a child. And I think 17-year-olds can certainly be morally liable to be killed, but 7-year-olds I don't think can be. And so if there's a justification for attacking these children, I don't think it's the kind of justification that we normally have for attacking other soldiers. It's a lesser evil justification, namely more innocent children will be killed, or more innocent people will be killed unless this child is killed. So it has to be that form of justification. It's a despicable thing to do, to use children in that way. Obviously, I mean, I'm saying something completely banal when I say that. I think that's a mistaken view, and the reason for that is that the ambition of reestablishing a Muslim caliphate is something that will not go away. It's too deeply entrenched in the psyches of too many people, and as long as these people control territory, they will continue to enforce the Islamic law in these territories, which, as it's being practiced by ISIS, is unspeakably barbaric. They're forcing people to live under their rule, and they will continue to try to expand. And they will continue to try to expand by means of force. If they can be pushed out of the territory that they control militarily, then the threat doesn't go away, but it deprives them of the ability to force people to, large numbers of people, millions of people, from having to live under their control and to have bases for possible military expansion. And it also, in some ways, deactivates the obligation that Muslims believe that they have to act in certain ways if there is no caliphate. It's probably a bit too late for that now. One thing that is important, I think, is to try to prevent them from getting control over weapons that other groups now possess. I mean, that is one of the dangers of what I mentioned earlier, namely that the effort to push the ISIS forces out of the cities in Iraq and Syria should ideally be carried out by forces indigenous to the area. And yet, very often, those forces are extremely unreliable. They surrender very easily. Arming them well when they are unreliable might provide a source of armaments for ISIS. It is in the texts that these people appeal to that the people of the book must be subjugated to Islam. They must either convert or... the nice thing for Christians and Jews is that we are people of the book, and so as long as we live in subjugation to Islam and pay the poll tax, the jizya, we're okay. But all apostates have to be executed. And of course thieves have to have their hands amputated. All this is, these punishments, the Sharia law is there. As is the idea that there is a kind of permanent obligation to engage in jihad against the infidel. I mean, one doesn't want to accuse ordinary Muslims of believing this stuff, but to deny that there is a textual basis for a lot of what ISIS is doing, I think, is just a mistake. It is there. It's not a far-fetched or strained interpretation of the text to think that. I think they have some special reason to dissociate themselves from ISIS, to speak out against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the Nusra Front and other such organizations. I would certainly think that if I were an adherent of a certain doctrine and other people were committing daily atrocities in the name of that doctrine, I would want to publicly insist over and over and over again that that's not the doctrine. That's not what I believe. And that they're advocating a poisoned version of what I accept. And so I guess I am surprised that there's not more of that kind of public denunciation. I wouldn't want to say that I think that that any particular Muslim has a duty to fight against ISIS or to be especially active. But that's because, in part, I think we all have some duty to do what we can. I think it's a terrible mistake to impose such drastic constraints on the immigration of Syrian refugees because of the concern that some of these people are members of ISIS who are infiltrating the societies. That may well be true, it probably is, but they're going to be homegrown indigenous ISIS members in all the European countries. So I think it is just extraordinarily inhumane and counterproductive and short-sighted to prevent the Syrian refugees from being able to settle. I think it's particularly true of the United States, which is the most shameful of all. We should welcome these people, and of course another thing is that the majority of these refugees are people who have been driven from their homes, separated from their families and friends by ISIS. They are the people from which we might hope to be able to recruit the people who would be really willing to fight against ISIS, to expunge the ISIS presence in the cities in which these people from which these people have been driven. So I think that's very important. The refugees are our allies. They're our potential allies against ISIS. And to treat them as if they were terrorists themselves, I think is just the most horrible and stupid and counterproductive thing. I visited Auschwitz and Birkenau a little less than a month ago. Spent most of the day there just walking around. It changes you a bit if you actually go into the remaining gas chamber there at Auschwitz, and you see the claw marks on the walls and that kind of thing, and you learn about the ways in which the prisoners or slaves or whatever they were there in Auschwitz received summary trials in front of Nazi judges, each trial lasting on average less than 1 minute, and the potential penalty being execution. Well, that stuff is being repeated now in the cities that are controlled by ISIS. There are daily beheadings in public places. A car will drive up and some men will get out with somebody who's bound, and they'll, in a very public place, force this person to kneel and whack the person's head off with a sword. This goes on more or less continuously in the areas occupied by ISIS. Thieves have their limbs amputated. Adulterers are stoned. Some people are crucified. There is a trade in sex slaves. Pagan women like Yazidis are turned into sex slaves for the fighters. Other women are forced to marry the fighters. To the extent that there is that there are trials there, they're in front of some Islamic cleric who will pronounce a death sentence after a few minutes of deliberation. What I wonder is, if the Nazi death camps were revived, would we just sit by and do nothing? But there's something like Nazi death camps in the world with us right now. How can we not do something about that?